Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. And also, the Search for the Ancient Bauble Kickstarter has launched, so make sure you go check that out. The Kickstarter campaign will last for 30 days, and after that, the playmat will no longer be available for purchase. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in from the Commander's Core studio. Welcome to the show. So today's episode comes to you courtesy of Caleb, who's been supporting this channel as a general tier patron. I truly couldn't do this without the support from amazing patrons like Caleb, so again, Caleb, thank you so much. And actually today, Caleb's gonna handle the intro for me.
Hey Mitch, this is Caleb from Georgia. I want you to build around Kraum, Ludevic's Opus, and Gilanra Collar of Wirewood to take advantage of their incidental card draw as much as possible. Thanks.
So, as Caleb said, we're going to be building a deck to take advantage of incidental card draw from Gilanra in Kraum. Gilanra is a 1/2 Elf Druid for 2 and a green that has tap, add green. When you spend this mana to cast a spell with converted mana cost 6 or greater, draw a card. And of course it also has partner because we are doing a partner deck. And then Kraum Ludevic's Opus is a 4/4 zombie horror that has flying and haste, and whenever an opponent casts his or her second spell each turn, draw a card. So each of these partner commanders go about drawing cards in different ways. Gilanra helps us out whenever we're casting big spells. So if we tap it for mana and then we utilize that mana for a big spell, we draw a card. And then Kraum goes about it in a different way, drawing us cards whenever our opponents meet certain conditions. If an opponent casts a second spell in a turn, we're going to be drawing a card from that. Now, keep in mind that this can be any opponent and on any turn. So Kraum can especially generate us a lot of card advantage throughout the game. And actually, each of these can generate us a lot of card advantage when we set ourselves up to do so. So let's move on and talk about what cards are going to help us out with this. First up, let's talk about Rootweaver Druid, a 2/1 Elf Druid that costs 2 and a green. When it enters the battlefield, each opponent may search their library for up to 3 basic land cards. They put one of those cards onto the battlefield tapped under your control, and the rest onto the battlefield tapped under their control. Then each player who searches their library this way shuffles it. So this card can actually ramp our opponents, but also ramp us a ton as well. And by ramping our opponents, well, they're going to have the ability to cast more spells in a turn, and we can draw more cards with Kraum. So we're helping them by also helping ourselves out quite a bit. Now, obviously, the best case scenario for this card is each of our opponents goes and gets their lands. Essentially, each of them ends up with 2 and we end up with 3. So it can be a very impactful card when it works in the right way. And speaking of that, then there's Template Discovery, which has Tempting Offer. It says search your library for a land card and put it onto the battlefield. Each opponent may search their library for a land card and put it onto the battlefield. For each opponent who searches a library this way, search your library for a land card and put it onto the battlefield. Then each player who searches a library this way shovels it. Essentially, you get 1 land at the very least, and for each opponent that chooses to go get a land, you get an extra 1. So, best case scenario, you're getting 4 lands. And again, ramping your opponents can actually be a good thing in this deck because you're getting more card advantage from your commander when they're casting more spells. So, let's also talk about the cards Rites of Flourishing and Gearport Orrery. Rites of Flourishing says at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card, and each player may play an additional land on each of their turns. So, everyone gets an extra card drawn and gets to put more lands into play, so yeah, more spells are going to be cast. And then Gearport Orrery is somewhat similar. It says each player may play an additional land on each of their turns. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, if that player has no cards in hand, that player draws 3 cards. So this can ensure that players ramp quicker and have more cards in their hand. And again, because of that, we can keep benefiting even more from incidental card draw. But we can also give all players access to a lot more mana with things like Heartbeat of Spring, Dictate of Karametra, and Zertaw Ancient. Heartbeat of Spring says whenever a player taps a land for mana, that player adds 1 mana of any type that land produced. And then Dictate of Karametra does the exact same thing, but we can take advantage of it first since it has Flash. And then Zertaw Ancient is essentially a creature that does the same thing, but it's a 7/5. So these essentially are mana doublers, but for all players. And again, giving everyone access to more mana lets everyone cast more spells, and we draw more cards. And on top of that, this also helps us cast even higher mana cost spells so we can benefit from Gilanra as well. And speaking of that, we're also going to be running cards like Curious Homunculus, Jace's Sanctum, and Thrix the Sudden Storm. Curious Homunculus has tap, add colors to your mana pool, spend this mana only to cast an instant or sorcery spell. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, if there are 3 or more instant and or sorcery cards in your graveyard, transform Curious Homunculus. It turns into Voracious Reader, which has prowess, and instant sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. So yeah, once transformed, this can help reduce the cost of some of our spells, which is fantastic in this kind of a deck. Again, we're going to be running a good amount of high converted mana cost instants and sorceries, and this can help us cast even more of them. So we're also going to be running Jace's Sanctum, which says instant sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and it says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, scry 1. So on top of helping with cost reduction, it can also help us with card selection as well. And then there's Thrix the Sudden Storm, which can help us out in a different way. It has flash and flying, and spells you cast with converted mana cost 5 or greater cost 1 less to cast and can't be countered. So this reduces the cost of our big spells and helps protect them as well. Now, as good as these cards are, there's one in my opinion that stands above the rest. And that would be the golden pick of this deck, which is the number 1 card out of our 99. And the golden pick for this deck is Arcane Melee. It's an enchantment for 4 and a blue, and it says instant sorcery spells cost 2 less to cast. Again, we're going to be running a lot of big instant sorceries in this deck, and this can help us cast a lot more of them. On top of that, this helps our opponents cast more spells as well. Now, for a lot of decks, that would be a downside, but for this deck, it's an upside. Again, the more spells our opponents can cast, the more likely they are to cast multiple in a turn, and then we keep drawing more and more cards with Kraum. So this card helps us cast more spells and get more incidental card draw. It essentially helps each of our commanders draw us even more cards, and that's why it's the golden pig. But what exactly are some of those big spells that this is going to help us cast? So of course, with a deck like this, we want some big spells that can draw us even more cards. Opportunity is going to draw us 4 cards at instant speed. And then Dig Through Time has Delve, and it says look at the top 7 cards of your library, put 2 of them into your hand, and the rest of them bottom of your library in any order. And then there's the new Commander's Insight, which says target player draws X cards plus initial card for each time they've cast a commander from the command zone this game. So first off, this counts both of our commanders, which is fantastic. And secondly, since this is an X spell, we can easily get its mana cost on the stack above 6. So as long as we cast this for X equals 3 or greater, we're going to be also drawing a card with Gilanra. But we also have some other permanents that can help us draw us a lot of cards as well, like Well of Ideas, Mind Unbound, and Nezahal. Well of Ideas says when it enters the battlefield, draw 2 cards. At the beginning of each other player's draw step, that player draws an additional card. At the beginning of your draw step, draw 2 additional cards. So when this comes into play, it draws us cards, which is great. On top of that, this is going to draw us 2 extra cards on each of our turns, and our opponents each get to draw 1 extra card on theirs. So again, giving our opponents cards is not really a bad thing for this deck because we're going to be getting more card advantage when they have more cards to use. But of course, this is going to benefit us the most. Speaking of benefiting us, there's Mind Unbound, which says at the beginning of your upkeep, put a lore counter on Mind Unbound, then draw a card for each lore counter on Mind Unbound. With this just staying in play for a few turns, it can get really out of control. And speaking of out of control, there's Nezahal Primal Tide. Nezahal has a ton of text, so here we go. This spell can't be countered. You have no maximum hand size. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, draw a card. Discard 3 cards, exile Nezahal, return to the battlefield, tapped under source control at the beginning of the next end step. Huh, did you catch all that? Basically, Nezahal is incredibly hard to deal with because first off, it can't be countered, and secondly, you can just discard 3 cards, which again in this deck is absolutely no big deal to get rid of it temporarily. It gives you no maximum hand size, which is huge for this deck, and on top of that, whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, which is going to happen quite often in a game of Commander, you draw a card. So your commanders are already draw engines, and you've got a lot of other draw engines in this deck, and Nezahal is yet another fantastic draw engine. That lets you keep all your cards. So yeah, it's pretty fantastic. And speaking of fantastic, let's talk about Reap the Past. This is a fantastic recursion spell that says return X cards at random from your graveyard to your hand, exile Reap the Past. So again, we can cast this for a ton, get a lot of cards back, and draw a card thanks to our commander. We can even utilize some board wipes that are X spells as well, like Displacement Wave and Distorting Wake. Displacement Wave is going to return all non-land permanents with converted mana cost X or less to the owner's hands. And then Distorting Wake is more targeted, returning X target non-land permanents to the owner's hands. Regardless, both of these can be very effective in a lot of situations for us. And speaking of very effective, let's talk about some cards like Brynolin the Mooncracker, Emoti Celebrant of Bounty, and Sunbird's Invocation. Brynolin says whenever it enters the battlefield, whenever you cast a spell with converted mana cost 6 or greater, you may return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. So we can get even more value when we're casting our big spells. And speaking of which, Emoti has Cascade, and spells you cast with converted mana cost 6 or greater have Cascade. So essentially we can get a ton of extra free value whenever we cast a big spell. And in a similar way, there's Sunbird's Invocation, which says whenever you cast a spell from your hand, reveal the top X cards of your library where X that spell's mana value. You may cast a spell with mana value X or less from 1 card revealed this way without paying its mana cost. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So yeah, we cast a big spell and then we get another big spell at the top. The amount of value that each of these comprise throughout the game is huge. Now, value is great, but how do we actually win with this deck? First off, let's talk about Seismic Assault and Ayula's influence. Seismic Assault says discard a land card. Seismic Assault deals 2 damage to any target. Again, with this deck, we're going to be drawing an absurd amount of cards. So Seismic Assault can help us utilize our lands in a different way. We can use this to ping down our opponent's creatures or just ping down our opponents. In a similar way, there's Ayula's influence, which says discard a land card, create a 2/2 green bear creature token. So again, we can put those lands in our hand to good use and make an army of bears out of nowhere. And speaking of creature tokens, let's talk about Ominous Seas, Nadir Kraken, and the Locust God. Ominous Seas says whenever you draw a card, put a foreshadow counter on Ominous Seas. And then by removing 8 counters from it, we get an 8/8 Kraken. So we can make some massive Krakens with this and take over the game from there. And speaking of Krakens, there's Nadir Kraken, which says whenever you draw a card, you may pay 1. If you do, put a +1 counter on Nadir Kraken and create a 1/1 blue tentacle creature token. So Nadir Kraken can keep getting larger, and it can also make us a large army as well. But the best of these has got to be the Locust God. It says whenever you draw a card, create a 1/1 blue and red insect creature token with flying and haste. Again, with this deck, we can draw an absurd amount of cards, and those cards then translate into hasty bugs with flying. So with the amount of cards that we can draw, we can easily overwhelm our opponents. Or, we can just drain them out with Psychosis Crawler. It says whenever you draw a card, each opponent loses 1 life. So again, if this stays in play for just a little bit, our opponents are going to be in big trouble. They're also going to be in big trouble when we cast some massive burn spells like Giant Zimulating Inferno, Comet Storm, and Treacherous Terrain. Giant Zimulating Inferno is going to deal X damage to each of up to 3 targets. So we can take out some big creatures or just ping our opponents in the face for a ton. And then Comet Storm has multi-kicker 1 and says choose any target, then choose another target for each time this spell was kicked. Comet Storm deals X damage to each of them. So it can deal massive damage to 1 thing, or just slightly lesser damage to 2 things, or slightly lesser damage to 3, and so on and so forth. Or, we just cast Treacherous Terrain and punish all of our opponents for putting a lot of lands into play. Which, again, we help them do. Because this is going to deal damage to each opponent equal to the number of lands they control. So, they essentially brought this upon themselves by taking advantage of all the lands that you were giving them. Regardless, this deck has a lot of ways to draw a ton of cards, cast huge spells, and finish our opponents off. But now it's time for me to wrap things up and give you my final thoughts on this deck. The partner combination of Gilanra and Kraum is a fantastic one. They each can provide you with a ton of incidental card draw throughout the game. And on top of that, they give you access to a lot of fantastic cards that work really well with your strategy. Again, you essentially can give your opponents access to more mana and more cards, and then they cast more things and you draw more cards, and then you punish them for that. So yeah, definitely a really unique combination and a fantastic one in my opinion. And with that, this show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.